Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to the museum to our lunchtime talks on a Wednesday. It's my pleasure to introduce Joseph McWilliams today, who, again, in truth, needs, I think, little introduction from any of us. Joseph McWilliams spent much of his early career as a teacher in the College of Art, where he was influential on a generation of students there. He then gave up teaching to devote himself full-time to his painting. And as well as that, he runs the Cave Hill Gallery in Belfast with his wife, Catherine. The McWilliams, I think, are best described as an artistic family. Joseph, his wife Catherine, and Simon, his son, all well known to us and all represented indeed in this year's Royal Ulster Academy exhibition. Some years ago, there was a book published on the late 19th, early 20th century Irish painter William Orpin, written by Bruce Arnold, and he titled the book Orpin, Mirror to an Age. And I think that title, Joseph McWilliams, Mirror to an Age, could stand very well for Joseph McWilliams' subject matter. Because I think in looking at his paintings, we do see ourselves, our lives, and certainly our society reflected there. So it's my pleasure to introduce Joseph McWilliams.
Thanks very much. I'll be 63 next month. I honestly can't believe it. I still hear the description ringing in my ears, young Belfast artist. And now, in confirmation of my aged status, I've been invited to speak to the heady title, Joseph McWilliams, His Life and Work. And I have to say, it's so full of self-aggrandizement that I have to shy away from it. But since that is the title, I thought it would be appropriate to actually mention a few very, very early influences, particularly when I see so many young people in the audience and some teachers in the audience. When I was 5 or 6 years of age, my father took me up to a Brady's shop at the top of the Duncairn Gardens, and he bought me 5 circular blocks of paint. I think I'd started school at the time, but I remember these blocks of tempera colours. They were red, blue, green and yellow. And I remember the brilliance of those colours. And to this day I still remember their smell. And I think that had some say in setting me down the primrose path of painting. But then, afterwards, I went to the Star of the Sea Primary School on Holidays Road, Belfast, where I was extremely fortunate to have for 1 year a teacher called Piers Hegarty. And I've always thought afterwards of those lines from Gray's Elegy of the people in the graveyard, the time is forgotten, born to blush and sing and waste their sweetness in the desert air. And I keep thinking of Mr. Hegarty because he was a remarkable teacher. And I wrote a little bit about him in the Irish News recently in an article. And if you don't mind, I wouldn't mind just referring to that before I start. I remember his use of art in class and the absolutely powerful enchantment he created for us in using images. And I said at the time that when he would produce, he'd produce a large folio of brilliant pictures, and the whole class would rub their hands with glee because we knew we were going to be transported beyond the confines of the New Lodge Road. And he would put these colourful paintings on top of an easel in the room. And there were all sorts of images. They may not necessarily have been marvellous art pieces, but I remember one particular, children in a woodland picking bluebells and primroses. And I remember in that dark panelled room of the classroom seeing these images up. He would invite us into these pictures. At least that was my memory. I felt I was being invited into them. And somehow we belong to the pictures. Now, illustrations for adults and for children, just simply looking at paintings, they have a kind of visual depth beyond the perspectival. When we saw these pictures as children, we wandered into the pictures, we wandered into the woods, we smelt the flowers, we heard the birds sing. And I deeply remember looking at that easel and thinking that the sunlight was rattling on it. And after that, when I left that class and real education took over, the boredom of it in a sense, I think there's a hangover from art that stuck with me, rightly or wrongly, but certainly from that time on, I felt confirmed in my status as an artist. So be wary of all you teachers out there who have an enormous power over children at that age. And I've often thought of Mr. Heckley, he's long dead, and I often wondered, did he realise just how powerful an enchanter he was? However, later on, I went to the art college. After secondary school, went to the art college, and at that point, I suppose, the world of entertainment began. And I use the word entertainment deliberately because, pardon me, there's always been a strain of politics running through my work. And there's always been a strain of politics running through all of us. And we've all felt the strain of politics, even if it was only the strain of avoiding talking about them. Whatever you say nothing, was that old political mantra had a long and I think unhelpful innings. I've always believed, so be prepared to be offended if you are offended, I've always believed that we should never tailor our conversation to suit other people's prejudices. And I tried not to do that as I went through my painting life. Not that I said too many things, but I think it would have been far better if we'd done that in the past. So the very first political image I remember doing wasn't within the past 30 years, but was in fact in my first year at art college, 1958. And if I can have lights, please. It was it's a very bad reproduction, it's a very old piece of, but it was simply, I put this in because it was done in 1958. You can see there folks Sinn Féin scrubbed out in the corner. But further down, the subject matter at the time, I remember the tutor said he wanted us to work on the theme, the entertainer. He was, of course, thinking of John Osborne's play, The Entertainer. But on the way to the college that day, I saw the ubiquitous wall murals in Belfast in 1958. There weren't as many in those days. But they generally had an exhortation to the Pope. And in this particular, they also were very closely linked to the notion of graffiti, hence this childish figure. And also at that time I discovered, in book form of course, the Spanish painter Antonio Tapies, who worked on these graffiti and scraped wall surfaces, and it simply appealed. I was too immature really to grasp the full depth of the work of Tapies, but I liked the idea of the wall. So this little figure I put on my page with gouache colours had folk Sinn Féin, and in the corner had written what we all had seen in every exhibition, fuck the Pope. The tutor, who was unused to such language, came over to me and he said, "You can't put that in painting." And I said, "Why not? It's on the walls outside. You can't put it in painting." So it's very visible. It's just about there. I had fuck the Pope, but I had to scrape it out. However, the image is nothing. I mean, I'd simply put down to say that the first political image I created was in 1958. Then later, in 1966, Dublin celebrated, I put this painting in for a number of reasons. Dublin celebrated 50 years since 1916, on Kivnahown it was called, the Remembrance, and or any Gaelic scholar there will correct me. But they invited artists, of Irish extraction, to put pieces of work into this exhibition, somehow based on 1916. Now, despite the fact that I had a Catholic education in St Malachy's College, I had never done Irish history in my life. You know, it's one of those old fallacies, really. I never kicked or held a hurley stick or ran Gaelic football. In fact, I ran very far to get away from them. And In 1916, this was a hefty exhibition, and I, along with about 4 other Northern artists, entered for it. But what I find interesting about this, and it's a story against myself, I'd never studied Irish politics or history before, so I decided I would go out and read about 1916. But being 1966, at the time, I, like everybody else, in a sense, cloaked our politics with myth and grace and so on. And on this particular occasion, I took the Phoenix Rising, as I grandiosely called the painting, of a green, white and orange in Celtic tracery moving behind the GPO, but also in the corner, you can barely see it, I had actually Nelson's column toppling. Nelson's column was blown up later that year. And I also had these zoomorphic figures from the Book of Kells, animal sort of figures, Celtic crosses, and there's 1 or 2 figures about Pierce's somewhere around here, somewhere. There's a hand holding an orange sash. I'm not quite sure what I had in mind there, but the point is, the fact that I wrapped it around Celtic tracery showed that I, like everybody else, was looking at history with a mythological grasp. In other words, very, I hadn't experienced, as we all have experienced since, bombs, guns, etc. and so on, in going off in proximity. So this was a painting which was largely painted out of total lack of experience of what actually a revolution or 1916 was. At the time, and for years, this is why it's not, I've always been a landscape painter. And in this particular talk, since I'm talking about myself and my work, it would be wrong of me not to run along my paintings that have a strain of politics in with my landscape painting. So I've always painted landscape. These were farm buildings in Cushendall. We holidayed there throughout the childhood of my children. And, I'm sorry, I keep thinking that is one of those. Early morning light in Jordanstown. I remember painting this, it was 1970, but it was typical of the paintings I did in the late 50s, 60s. In fact, it was catching sunlight, dappling through trees, not a million miles away from my memory of children collecting bluebells in the classroom painting. So there's an influence. In fact, we are generally influenced not only by landscapes we see, but by pictures of landscapes we see. Hence the influence that Paul Henry has on Irish painting today. Lots of people paint thatched cottages when they've never seen one in their lives. So this was a morning landscape. Then, at home, I would paint my back gardens. These are my geraniums in 1970, I think, in my last house. I painted these because we were leaving house and I wanted a visual memory of what had impact on me at the time. But then 1969 came, and suddenly I'd just come back from Connemara. I'd been painting landscapes in Connemara, and we arrived back in Belfast to find that all hell had broken loose. And it really was, those of us here who are old enough to remember, it really was an incomprehensible period. We just didn't believe that suddenly we should be involved in what amounted to a civil war, or appeared to be. This was based on my parents were still living in the New Lodge Road, my mother and father. And this was immediately after internment, when this was a dormobile, as it was called, of a local man was pulled out into the barricades. And the problem is, you can imagine those days, the barricades were made up of things that people tore from their own area. So it certainly wasn't whatever imagined enemy was being attacked, but in fact it was the people from the area. So in a sense, that the Lyceum picture house at the left here was set alight. This was that was the picture house that we went to as children. And in the 1940s, 50s, the cinema was a magic sort of outlet really for us. It was burnt. Then when the army came in, there was that honeymoon period which was so often talked about, and eventually there was comments like, "No tea for Dad's Army." Dad's Army, as you may remember, was a television programme at the time about the Home Guard, and everything then changed. In this case, I was still a landscape painter, and I said in the catalogue at the time, it was a bit like throwing stones in paint. I didn't know how to react, but I felt I had to react in some way. Now, even in saying this, I have to say I feel far too self-important in talking that way. I mean, we all reacted in some way. Because I painted, I reacted in paint. I'm not too sure what's happened here. New landscapes then occurred, and this is where, as a landscape painter, this was Baltic Avenue, Antrim Road. The shop had just been bombed. It was the beginning of a long series of bombs, and that we still hadn't adjusted to it. There were new barricades on the road that the army or police had set up, these, which closed every night. But I remember looking at this in particular, and we see it to this day during redevelopment, but it had always occurred to me that you would see the fireplaces still adhering to the walls of the bedrooms, and the wallpapers, which people at somewhere at some time selected from Christie's wallpaper shop and spent a long time peering over books to see if this wallpaper would suit the bedroom or not. And I often thought that when we see these interiors thrust in the light, that we're seeing something of the interior life of people. And it added an added sadness I felt to bombs. Also, still being a landscape painter, I could never resist the fact that there was a twilight. And twilight for me, while it's a sad time, it's also a very quiet and thoughtful time. The clouds then become not unlike bunting, and they're linked to the windows of the houses. So compositionally, I needed the eye to be brought across, as it is down here. But also the clouds are running through the painting. It's a long time ago since I painted that, and none of these paintings I would paint that way today, and a lot of them I don't like at all. I hope you don't own any of these. Then the O'Neill election came along, and I come back to those little childish figures. The O'Neill election, 1970, still had "This We Will Maintain" slogan. And I remember again that there was now a growing proliferation of exhortations to the Pope on the walls. And I remember making this painting and calling it "This We Will Maintain." And you see the childish figure running through it, if you see the head up here. And when I put these in, and it links to the earlier one, I've always felt that the sort of politics we had then, have now, and hopefully changing, was a graffiti sort of politics. It was politics depending on slogans. And the type of people who do graffiti tend to be either children or childish, or have a malevolence which is linked to childish malevolence. So I wanted these figures, which are fundamentally graffiti and destroying walls, somehow linked to the politics. So this We Will Maintain. It also has the little mantra down here, I think it was love, joy and peace, which used to coincide with a lot of the other religious exhortations. So I often thought that these particular paintings had a kind of religion coupled with a kind of politics, and maybe we could have done without all of them. Then the landscapes changed. The British Army came. This was Dawson Street, the Antrim Road. They built their army post, and as someone pointed out at the time, they were coming from places like Aden and Kenya with background experience, and in fact the camouflage you all used for a city street was the one you'd use in a jungle, as you can see. And while it might very well have been, I was going to sound racist, but I'm not, but it might very well look as though it would stop some less powerful instruments than bullets. Afterwards, the army discovered that these, while they were attractive, and they were attractive, and for artists like ourselves, they were things that you wanted to paint. In fact, while I was painting this, a group of paratroopers bundled me into a Land Rover and took me into Girdwood Barracks, and astonishingly kept me outside a Nissen hut, and I could hear over the radio. I gave them my name and address, that was all. No, my name, I didn't even have my address at that time. And I heard a voice saying, Joseph McWilliams, 11 Floral Gardens, Glengormley. And I was amazed because I didn't live there, but a close friend of mine did. And both of us had gone, stupidly enough, one time to a meeting, and it was afterwards we discovered it was a sort of meeting no sane person should be in. But somehow our names must have got dovetailed together in some computer world, and they come up. And anyway, they then come back to me when the voiceover then come back and it said correction, Joe McWilliams. Ulster Polytechnic artist. And then I said, that's all right. So he came out to me and he said, you can go ahead back there and paint if you want, as long as you stand in front and let us see you, which I had been doing. And I said to him, tell me, which do you think would be easier, say I was a terrorist, to go down there and sneakily take a photograph of it, or stand for 3 hours with paint? And I'm sorry to say he didn't see the humour of it. And maybe he didn't, maybe he actually didn't know the difference. But however, then the army post became stronger, and this particular one's a 3-dimensional piece. And I'm sure it's not wrong when I say, but it's owned by a former Minister of Home Affairs, and maybe I should have said it, Bill Craig. I will say, because he bought a public collection. And this painting I always feel is rather sad, because it's the post at the top of the New Launch Road, or was there. But over here to the left, anyone who's interested in antique books, was a beautiful antique bookshop. And behind these fences build up rubble, because kids, all sorts of malcontents, etc., throw things at them, and it builds up a rubbish. But on top of that, on one occasion, a bomb was thrown at it. And as almost invariably happened with things built to withstand bombs, the place wasn't damaged, but the little shop was. And all the precious books were scattered all over the Antrim Road. And they were lying around for weeks afterwards. And in many ways it epitomised the inadequacy of the country in which we lived, where the beautiful things of life were scattered at the expense of for what, you know. So this, although it's about an army post, it's also about this little shop which was bombed, and the aftermath of the violence, the rubble and the detritus of the madness that we were suffering in. The army post was cleaned up and spruced up, and a new and even stronger one was built, and that lasted there until quite recently. But one of the things that always struck me about these pieces of work is that they most emphatically were singularly more interesting and better made than most pieces of modern sculpture we see in the Tate Modern. Beautifully welded pieces, built for what they should do, and they were also attractive. And I seriously do think that they were much more effective pieces of sculpture than most of what Damien Hirst produces. Not all of what Damien Hirst produces. I'm feeling something stuck here, but I'll go on back. And that's me when I had black hair. And I worked at this time, I was then teaching art teachers, training art teachers, and we worked in a community centre in Ardown, which catered for both Catholic and Protestant youngsters, literally at the peace line in Alliance Avenue. And it was, we had groups of art teachers who came from different disciplines, like jewellery, designers, painters, sculptors, photographers, and they got together as teams and tried to work with the children from there to produce something using their expertise. We usually ended up with 8mm films, and on one occasion the army confiscated them while they were being filmed. But while we were doing it, over a period of 1 year, the community centre was bombed, firebombed, and the bomb was thrown at the back of the community centre, and it was the back door was scorched. Now what was interesting, all the children and all the workers, who were a totally mixed bunch of people, as we strangely say in Northern Ireland, they were mixed. As though they were like cough mixtures shuffled together. And when we tried to find out who threw the bomb, nobody knew, and the reason was that they thought anybody could have done it. Nobody wants us to exist. You know, in other words, was it an orange group or a green group? But over a period of a month, the bombs became, it was seen, just fire bombs were thrown at the back, until eventually the children we worked with used the door as a gauge for the success of a bomb. When I would arrive in with the students, they'd say, "Sir, there's another bomb, the door's nearly gone." And, you know, and the door became the measure. And afterwards, I was young and more idealistic than I would be now, I think. The door came off, and I took the door and mounted it. It's a burnt door, and in fact I think I came to someone in the museum who gave me some nylon material that you inject into the wood to keep it alive and well. So the door I put up on a board, and behind it this fire or rainbow effect dropped into the gallery and steps, as a kind of visual invitation to walk behind the bird community door. Now, I say it's sort of idea would never materialise now in my wisdom and old age. But the door has gone back to the community centre where it originally came from. It's now at the bottom of the Dunkirk or Cliftonville Road, and in their entrance hall in North Belfast Community Centre, you'll see this door sitting there. It takes up a lot of space. I'm sure they could do without it. And the door then, at those years that followed, and I'm going far too slowly, I'm sorry. The years that followed then, there was a terrible period which was known as for us who lived in the Cliftonville Road, was a period known as the period when the Shankly butchers were killing people. And I remember at the time, I know it's a strange thing, but I'm explaining at least one painting which the Arts Council now have. I called it Rendezvous with a Rainbow. I was sitting in my car one day and the sun was shining through the windscreen. And believe it or not, that's the sort of shadow you would get at a certain time in the year when the sun shines if you're in a car, cast on the ground. I was getting out of a car park and I saw this shadow. I found it interesting. And it's a silly way, I'm possibly giving away the mental aberrations which I normally suffer from. But as I got out, I remember thinking about the people who are bundled into these cars. Now, the son of a neighbour had been bundled into a car and was driven down the Cliftonville Road and hanging out of the car, and he shouted so much they let him go. And he survived. He's now a married man with a family living somewhere other than Ireland. But I remember at the time thinking all the things you might see and think, shadow the ground. So this painting became then the idea of an open door of a car, which could be an invitation to something with a rainbow in it. It could in fact be something delightful you're getting into. You might be meeting your potential wife or somebody else's. And the door is open, but you could also be opening into something terrible. So that is really a double-edged painting in the sense that it's one about the troubles and yet it's one about possibilities. Open doors can be something good as well as something bad. That followed on a series of quick ones which I call Lover's Lane, and I'll go through these quickly. The rubble, artistically I think was the wrong thing to do, but I felt that what was happening outside had nothing to do with art, so I took the images of the papers and the tales and spilt them onto the mount of a whole series of paintings, more or less saying, I'll ruin this landscape painting by doing this. And these Lover's Lanes were based on a number of killings, but one in particular where a man was brought to a lover's lane and killed. And when he arrived there was someone waiting for him. You know, it was a horrific, just everything that wrapped around it, the combination of love and hate, I felt, and the countryside and the landscape all belonged to maybe the stuff that art is, really. I really don't know what's happening. There's a number of paintings I've skipped through, and there's many that's bad. They've jammed in the carousel, I suspect. However, landscape was still a part of my life. This was on the way to the Polytechnic. I passed Crew Street. Crew Street. I'm mixing up my politics with my landscapes. And this was simply a Belfast landscape, and it's still vaguely reminiscent from my point of view of the childhood influences at school. And it was the idea of growing up in the city. Anyone who's sort of my generation who grew up in the red brick part of the city will remember that the summers were as much to do with sunlight on red brick as it was anything else, and even dust on waste grounds. Now that's not to talk as though I'm saying, and I used to live in a cardboard box. No, it's a fact that, one might live in deprived surroundings and still enjoy life in summers and what we had. I don't ever remember feeling outrageously deprived until I wanted a bicycle. But, however, so I've always this memory of looking at the Castlereagh Hills in the sunlight from far away and through Gantries. Of course, these weren't here at that time. They're added, but that's essentially about a Belfast in sun. Again, Cushendall, Glenarm, always appealed to me, and I only showed this photograph to explain this painting, because there's a vague connection with the problems that they were knitting, but it wasn't deliberate, but it might have been there. And this was simply looking at a landscape and seeing 2 or 3 different visions in it. The distant landscape, which is framed. And I mean, maybe it's only me, or maybe everyone, I've always feel, wherever I am, I want to be somewhere else. You know, when you look over and people say, isn't this a lovely landscape? Give me those binoculars and I see those trees on the other end of the lake, you know. Or looking across at distant fields, and it's quite true, far off fields do look greener. And they're also inaccessible and present us with that kind of wonder. So in a way, that's what a lot of my paintings were. Even this part with all the wire protecting, the man was protecting his garden from the depredations of people running along the beach. There was also a very rusted gate, but it was very red. And I always remember running across with little sheep-like clouds. So essentially, it's a romantic image. And it's one of those things that I felt I always escaped to the Glens of Antrim, despite what was going on in town, because I was teaching either in our down initially and then in the Polytechnic. But I was always going up and down the New Lodge Road to see how my parents were doing. I'm just realising as I'm speaking to you that a significant number of slides have skipped, but I don't earlier ones. Landscapes in Cushendall again. This was wigwam turf wigwams. And then we come back to Belfast and we're back into 12th of July. One of the first paintings I did at the 12th of Coras Circus. And on this occasion, it was becoming a bit more difficult to reach the parade with my paints, because in those days the army and the police were never quite sure what you were doing if you had a fan near them and you were doing something, and I was working in the car. So the Saracens, I'm going all sorts back and front. The Saracen tanks here became part of the image, stopping you looking in. But essentially it's actually about parades, it's about movement and colour. And the fact that the army and presence was there added a new dimension to it. On this occasion, I was driving across what we knew as Carrickhill Unity Flats to paint the parades, when suddenly the army came up and put these sniper screens across, and I couldn't see them. I tried to go back the other way and there were sniper screens at the Shankle Road, so I was forced to sit there and paint what I saw, which was essentially little walking feet and figures running back and forth. But in some ways, at the same time, it was symptomatic of our time. You know, we are so, I was going to say schizophrenic, that's definitely the wrong use of the word. But we were so split as people that we couldn't even look at each other anymore, and that's the sort of feeling I had. Now, admittedly, they were up ostensibly to stop sniping, but at the same time, you had that feeling of, you can't look at this, you know, you're not allowed to see this. And then later, there were still more. Every time there was a spate of either Loyalist violence or IRA violence at this particular time, I used bits and pieces of the newspaper items. Now, after any parade, there's rubble and paper. You know, after the 12th, the streets are absolutely a mound of it, and the dustmen from the City Hall come out and clean it up. And I'm sure they love doing it. But on this particular occasion, I had the rubble falling out again. And this rubble has got a lot of political murders wrapped in the news items. And in the background, there is the parade marching around Coras Circus. And I've often said this, and I have to say at the time, Bill Craig bought this at the time, 1970 something or early. And when he was buying it, he came over to me and he said, at first I thought, he mustn't see what, I'll have to get him to look at this painting closer. And he said to me, not that I agree with the sentiments behind it. And I was delighted he said that. And we had a long talk. I discovered he had a marvellous collection of Yugoslav primitive painting. And we had a long talk about the painting, but it was quite interesting that he bought the painting knowing that it wasn't a compliment, knowing, as I said to him, well, I'm not painting folk parades. And he said, I know. So I borrowed it back from him for an exhibition. And that exhibition actually, this is again Orange Men passing St. Patrick's Church in Donegal Street. That was a church I went to as a child. And on the 12th of July, if you wanted to hear the bands at their best, you went down there. And so the parades passed, and the idea of the movement of colour, there's a whole a number of reasons why. One, there's the idea itself has obviously political undertones for me, but also the simple practicalities of painting. I love the idea of the movement of colour. But at another, even more practical level, as a painter, I really never wanted to paint in a realistic way, and I couldn't get away from it. If you're unfortunate enough to have been a child at school who was good at drawing, your drawing is reinforced by the teacher, and you go to art college because it's being reinforced, you still continue to draw. And you end up by having a competition between your drawing and your painting. And I always found a kind of, I tried to get them both in the same painting, wasn't working, but the parades helped me, because if you try to paint a parade academically and look at it, you can't, it walks away from you. So they helped me free my painting. The next one, I really put this in, it's the same painting, or it's another painting, but simply I pointed out to people to show part of our problem. In a sense, here's the parade passing St Patrick's Church, Donegal Street, and some of you may or may not know that the figure here of St Patrick was carved by Patrick Pearse's father, as indeed was the high altar in this church, designed and carved by Patrick Pearse's father, who was in fact Church of England, member of the Church of England. So, I mean, it's if we only realise that what we, I think, humorously call the Troubles, and we call it the Troubles because essentially it's a family illness. When there's something sort of not quite nice in the family, we use euphemisms to cover it up. So we have always used the euphemism of the Troubles. So, and I think hopefully with today's news, maybe the notion of the family will take over. And here we have the marchers again. This is a larger painting the Arts Council have. And I've always thrown in little bits of deliberate humour. Why, although it's there. As I painted these, I noticed there's an MOT sign up here for cars. And as you know, MOTs are only given to cars when they're running out of steam and they're maybe at the end of their days. So I've thrown this little bit of political cheek in. And here we have the soldiers and the Saracens moving about. And again, coming back to this, I was moving into, I think, the 80s now. I visited Dublin National Gallery, saw some icons of St George and the Dragon, lovely images which were disappearing under a patina of age. And I remember looking at one in particular and thinking, that's like a King Billy wall mural. And then I moved from that, the notion that this is maybe where a lot of our heroes are, that they become icons of the past. They're as relevant today as possibly, as I said in the catalogue, black magic is to medicine. And so this is Pearse, as he was originally, and then with time disintegrating. And finally, the final piece is could very well be the same as there he is disappearing. And this is actually what happens, images, as you know, it happens, icons. And here's Carson going exactly the same way. I realise that we have always in Northern Ireland a tendency to make saints out of our politicians, just as the way Marxists made a saint out of Marx. I remember a colleague of mine who used to quote Marx, the way evangelicals quote the Bible. So, and here he is disappearing with time. Orange and green saints, having looked at murals in Assisi and seeing these saints not only falling off the wall, but bits of plaster replacing where the mouth was. And that's exactly what's happening in some of these. So there's Carson to the left, Carson to the left, and Ian Paisley with wings been risen up, I think. Plunkett, and there's Pearse rising up like the Ark of the Covenant. But it's essentially, it's a painting about saints of the past whose relevance is suspect today. And this was one that this was called a 1933 icon. And the thing about Northern Ireland, almost nobody doesn't know what you're talking about when you refer to well-known political stories. And or religious stories for that matter. The Open University, discovered when they first put the Bible studies on one of their courses, the highest score in biblical studies was, guess where, Northern Ireland. And the score was astonishing. It was something like 88% of the high scores in Northern Ireland. So I think the same was said of our politics. But this was I did this painting of Basil Brooke, and as icons, real icons have, they usually have legends written around them. This legend said he would not have won about the place in 1933. And I produced this painting at an exhibition once. This elderly woman came up to me and she said, Basil Brooke didn't have a moustache. And I was in the other room, and you know, when that happens, you actually don't know. And I thought, I'm not sure. Surely he did. Then I thought of the painting. I said, yes, he did. So, oh, yes, he had a moustache, but not in 1933. And I said, well, the story isn't about 1933, it's about Basil Brooke. And she said, well, anyway, I think it's a disgrace he should be remembered for having said that. And the story goes on, but it's too long to tell. I think I ended up by saying, well, if Margaret Thatcher had said in 1933, some of you employed blacks, but I wouldn't have one about the place, would we still remember it today? And I think she agreed we might. And here's I just call this a cracked icon. Again, it's Basil Brooke, and the wood is cracked with age, and it belongs to the past. And then at the same time, I have this icon, which was based on the saying attributed to Pearse: splendid and holy causes are served by people who are themselves splendid and holy. And I painted an image of splendid and holy people. That sort of, if you extrapolated from that into what has happened then and since, and I think it's a quite legitimate interpretation. So there we have some people that we wouldn't like to meet on a dark night. And then, of course, on the way to the Poly, I would see the dump, and I wanted to paint nice things. And the dump, anyone who's, it's now, I think it's going to be a golf course, but at any dump you see the birds fly around. So I did a series of paintings based on the dump. That was a summer's day, and believe it or not, there's a lot of grass then. And the birds are swirling, disturb the air, just like the parades. In a sense, it's the idea of me wanting freedom within a static background. And the same goes for these birds on a misty summer's day. The mist in the background down the loch, and the birds are linked to the movement of JCB diggers, where you see the tracks of the JCB diggers. But in a sense, all of my paintings are fundamentally landscapes. And they're either landscapes with birds, trees, or orange men. You know, here are the birds and Christian doll. Again, I'm going through these quite quickly because I really am talking too long on some of these images. This one I called May the Lord in His Mercy Be Kind to Belfast, and the Arts Council of this minute. And I can't remember, a number of things happened at this time which made me want to paint this trio. It's Ian Paisley in the middle. His halo, I've made the shape of the television screen, because I firmly believe that some heroes only exist through the media. And without the television screen, maybe a lot of our heroes wouldn't exist at all. And so that's part of the image. You can't see this was a cheeky one, I have to say. This one of Robinson was done just after that affair. Was it Clontibbrit, was it? And he was fined, and he was ill-advised to pay the fine instead of doing it 3 or 4 days in a Republican jail, which would have been marvellous for him. But he didn't, and there were some rude comments, but you can't see, there's a kind of, in this image you can't see it, but there is in fact a kind of yellowness going down here, which people refer to at the time. I'm not for a minute suggesting it was right, but I think he's ill-advised. Sammy had become Lord Mayor. Sammy Wilson, at that time, that was the first time round. And I did that, and you notice that the red, white and blue at the back here isn't paint. In fact, it's a Texas bag, a Texas plastic bag. This is a doily, and this is a wee bit of gold leaf that was torn. So I was deliberately making the image a bit tatty. This was him again. I called this, See Me, I'm the Lord Mayor. And then we had, and this is directly linked to Sammy. At that time, Margaret Thatcher, I can't remember what it was she said or did, but Sammy Wilson said that Thatcher was treating us like a colony. And he made a big say of this, that Northern Ireland treated like a colony, and it occurred to me that we had just lost our governor, Lord Grey. He was in fact the last governor of Northern Ireland. And at that time I thought, no, we used to be a colony when we had a governor, but maybe we're not anymore. So that led me into the painting which the Ulster Museum have downstairs. And the whole idea of the regalia and the medals and the pomp and circumstance of that world, I mean, it really is, it's amazing. I don't mind it existing. In many ways, when you look at Buckingham Palace, you would hate to see it go. But at the same time, when you looked at it here and saw these men coming in medal, I couldn't help but think of the last governor of Northern Ireland. I checked, I think only 3 governors left: the governor of the Cayman Islands, the governor of Gibraltar, and the last governor of Northern Ireland, which is how I titled the painting. And in the background I have, as a kind of joke, an elephant running away in the background with that, whatever those seats is, a howdah they're called, on top of the elephant, and all the pomp and circumstance, and Lord Grey himself. He also was the Chancellor of the University of Ulster when I was teaching there at the time, but I don't know what he thought about this. And here he is again with medals, etc., bedecking it, and the umbrella. It's the idea of the governor more than the reality of it. And then came a triptych which I called Icon with Glasses. And it's a triptych. There's on one hand, icons have always legends written around them and little indications of what they may or may not be in Greek lettering. On this occasion we have A in one hand and B in the other, the Armalite in the ballot box. And as with glasses tend, if the light catches them in a certain way, suggest that one eye is being blinded and the other isn't. So in this case, this image became more deteriorated as time went on, and in the triptych the final one has disappeared and only the Armalite is left. And I must say I am delighted that today that is a thing of the past now, hopefully, and this is an historical painting in a sense. And then in 1985 I had the misfortune to have a heart attack, which surprised me nearly as much as being 63. And I felt very sorry for myself. I was 46, and anyone who's had one knows that it's not a very pleasant thing, no matter what you pretend. And this was the first painting I did after, during my recovery period. It was out in the garden. I planted earlier, for the first time, Jerusalem artichokes, which anyone who gardens knows you shouldn't plant, and anyone who eats knows you definitely shouldn't eat them. Otherwise you lose a lot of friends for the duration of your meals. So these were but on this period I came out to the garden. It was the first time I felt like painting. I noticed the cherry blossom in neighbours' trees down here, and the sunlight streaming through the cracks and the fence, and it lifted my heart a little, so I painted my vegetable garden. I just started to grow vegetables. And then what happened, having been pleased with that, every year since I'd grown vegetables, so they became as much part of my painting as the orange parades. The following year I was much healthier, so I grew an enormous number of vegetables. I have sprouting broccoli and potatoes and runner beans and a whole array of Chinese leaves. The only year I was ever able to grow Chinese leaves without giving a meal to the slugs. And then this was a year I grew lots of lovely broad beans and Florence fennel, which is a lovely soft leaf. And down there the runner beans, which are so easy to grow. But I like the look of vegetable gardens, as simple as, in many ways I much prefer them to gardens full of flowers. Ideally we'd use both. Again, an oil painting of the same garden, and one city garden which was used for Frank Ormsby's book of Northern Poetry. And recently, this is a little sketch for a larger painting which is upstairs now, of red shard and silver shard. It's an absolutely marvellous plant. Anyone who grows vegetables will tell you it's like sunlight in the garden. It's beautiful. But at the time when the word was the framework, I did this painting called Orange Men in the Framework. And someone just got I think it's an MBE here, and he's putting on his white gloves, and he looks a wee bit disdainful from these other people inside. So essentially it's a kind of mishmash of the idea of figures in the framework. And then the Guardian, Manchester Guardian, asked me would I be painting orange parades in a particular year, and they photographed me while I was doing it. And while I was doing it, I was surrounded by drummers, and I came closer to the bands than I've ever been. They literally walked around me and occasionally stopped. They were beating a living. These were tartan drummers. I have, you see, pixelated a lot of the faces. That's a term the television people use, pixelation. And when they pixelate someone in television, it's usually someone who's at something to hide or being afraid to be seen. So I put a little bit into some faces in the bands to suggest that maybe they're not all folk bands. This was one of the photographs, and not this band, but a particular Scottish band came around to me like this while I was painting. And this is a painting of the Merchant, and they threw coins at me while I was painting, and one of them said to me, "Is that fucking green? Don't put green in it, put an orange." And, you know, it was actually, it sounds funny, but it actually was relatively serious, and the man from the Guardian couldn't believe it. You know, he really couldn't believe it. He came over to me and he said, he says, "I can't understand that." He says, why were they so aggressive? And I says, "Maybe any publicity is bad publicity." And the photographer who was there at the time says, "Yes." He said, "I lost a camera the last time I was doing this." But I'm being very hard on this. This is one that the UTV own in their collection of beating drums in Donegal Street. And then marching in the rain past the Belfast Telegraph. Marching in the rain again. I'm doing this very... This one is upstairs in the AIB collection. Again, it's a flute band passing O'Kane's in Donegal Street. I photographed this while I was painting. I was painting the parade passing in the background, passing the Irish News, when I swear at one point I counted 25 people down the road and 2 policemen on the far side. And I thought, now, if they were to do this next Saturday, they'd all be arrested. And I entitled the painting "Passing the Irish News." And here again, the umbrella has become a kind of a cloak, or that's a figure you may recognise, and that's a pixelated figure of Ian Paisley, actually. And so this was a painting of just called "Umbrellas in Donegal Street." And of course, I still eventually would always get away from it all by going up the Cave Hill and looking down at the city and painting it. It's an awful thing to say, but Belfast looks at its best from the top of the hill. I said that to a friend once. He says it looks even better when you're in an aeroplane flying. And then I was invited to do a poster for the Observer for the what was it, the 150th anniversary of Queen's University Festival, or 150th anniversary of Queen's. So this was a firework display. But I mean, I'm sorry, I just always can't resist a little indication of something. And up there you'll see there's a Union Jack and a tricolour flying. Just couldn't resist a little political joke. But that was a nice highlight. This was a St. Patrick's Day parade. I have painted Republican parades, but there just isn't any colour in them. Like I've done one or two, and I should have put one in, but they're not nearly as colourful as I thought the St. Patrick's Day one would be, but instead I just thought it was interesting to see these people in gear with the what do you call it? I can't remember the name of those shoes. I still belong to the world that referred to them as gutties. And then Drum Cree. Finally, that's a television battle of Drum Cree, which actually, as I did it, as I watched it, I thought it's practically the same as the Scarva battle. And then the image of the parade flowing out of the church, I have obviously tailored it to make it a different thing, but essentially it's about a rush of colour being, in a sense, I suppose, spewed out and pouring down. But on the other side there are the gravestones of the graveyard. And I tried to make a kind of a metaphor that you create yourselves by looking at it, in a sense. And then, more recently, I Drumcree again, and this time, the first one I called Christians Leaving Church. The second one I called Watching Christians Leaving Church, because I went down 2 years ago. UTV asked me would I be down, and I was down to paint, and I couldn't get near it, and I couldn't get near the play for a number of reasons, because I've never, anyone who's come down to Drumcree will tell you this, there are almost more television crews than there are Orange Men. It's absolutely staggering. It becomes a large scale, it becomes a staged event, and it was like a pop concert. And I realised that the people who are watching, it was a bit like the Gulf War, when everybody sat at their homes with their drinking sandwiches watching the war. You know, and I found that this is what's happening here. And then I have a couple of series of little ones where they are, I call these projectile Orange Men. Those who have young children know what I'm talking about. And here we are. And I'm coming to here we are. There's still a lot of these. They're coming and go. And lastly, the only reason I put this in, this is the Leper Street and Strathfield Street as it was about 3 years ago. And 40 years ago, I lived there as a child, and it was a totally different area. Away down at the background is what we terrible misnamed Peace Line. And I did a painting based on it because this was a little one for myself. It was really about memories. These two children dancing are in fact my son and daughter. I used to take them down to see my father, their grandfather, down here. And this is my father, who was a young man who used to stand at the corner solving the problems of the world with his friends. And here's my mother pushing a pram up the New Lodge Road. And in the background, smack up to date, is the Peace Line. So essentially it was about my memories, past and present, of the New Lodge Road. And the last painting I used is one I did in 1979, or 1989, when in fact there was it was 20 years of troubles. Do you remember that? And the whole world was aghast with 20 years of troubles. And what happened, I'm sure you know this as well as I do, that the occasion was marked, 20 years of trouble, by numerous church services, platitudes and much wringing of hands, and the increasing ubiquity of the phrase, where is it all going to end? Not, as you can see, when is it going to end, but where is it going to end? As though we were going somewhere and not standing still. And I'm delighted to say that today, because I think maybe we are going somewhere now. And I ended with a Valentine card, which I called an orange and green Valentine. I did it, I think, way back in 1980 something. And I thought, this is a Valentine for all of us, orange and green. And a Valentine is about an expression of love. So maybe we'll eventually reach that destination. And I'm sorry for speaking so long. Thanks very much.
Just thank Joe McWilliams on our behalf. I must say I'd forgotten how witty and humorous Joe was. When I was thinking of Mirror to an Age, I thought it was appropriate, but I really had forgotten about the humour that underlies all those images. Joe has kindly said he will take any questions if we have any.
I know I've gone far too long. Yes?
So do you think the irony of your paintings is lost on your general audience within the museum?
I don't know. I suppose the real answer is, and I know this might sound strange, I don't mind. You know, I think, I would like to think that paintings, any paintings, are liked because they are successful paintings, just as we listen to Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. The last thing in the world I think anyone is thinking about are lambs jumping in the air and cuckoos singing. You know, essentially it's the music and musical terms. So the answer might be yes and no, but I'm not too sure if I would care that much, you know. Although I mentioned about Bill Craig saying, you know, not that I don't like the sentiments behind it. I was pleased simply because he was a politician, and I didn't want to think he'd take it upon himself and say, oh God, I bought something which is attacking me, you know. But I'm not sure. I really can't answer that. Possibly yes, with some.
So John, I find that your attitude towards politics simply in the pictures that you really don't care about politics.
Oh no,
The way you
it's,
poking fun at them all the time, and that you find that they're a good subject for humour and ridicule themselves and poking fun at them. And I suppose people hear and start like, as long as we're left alone to do our own life, live in peace and that, we don't really care what's going on in the political side. Are you the same feeling?
to some extent, though, I suppose this was an awful line from the 60s when somebody said life was too serious to be taken seriously.